sorry about all the confusion. We did order extra chairs, but even our extra chairs didn't accommodate all of you. It's wonderful to see so many people here. So first of all, thank you all for coming. My name is Rebecca Bowling, and I'm the director of the Drescher Center for the Humanities. And of course, the Humanities Forum is under our purview. I want to welcome you, first of all, to this first Humanities Forum event. It's the first in our series of human rights lectures to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This series is being co-sponsored with the Social Sciences Forum, and I encourage you to pick up a Humanities Forum calendar if you don't already have one. They're on the one unclothed back table back there. I think we have a great lineup for the fall, as does the Social Science Forum. Human rights is a topic that should concern all of us, not just those of us concentrating our work in the humanities or the social sciences. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN General Assembly on 10 December 1948, included many rights that the countries whose representatives wrote it, even countries like our own, have not yet put into practice. How many of you knew that Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the commission that wrote the Declaration of Human Rights? Any of you? Okay, a few handfuls. How many of you have ever read the Declaration itself? Hey, I'm impressed. All 30 articles? Well, some of those articles, okay. I have made copies of that UN Declaration of Human Rights, which are also on that back table. So if you'd like one, feel free to pick one up after the lecture. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights contains 30 articles. It has a preamble. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about each one. It has a preamble which lays out, just 3 years after the end of World War II and all of its atrocities, the rationale for the Declaration. The first 2 articles explain that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, regardless of race, color, sex, language, religion or politics, national or social origin, property or birth. Articles 3 to 21 are similar to our Bill of Rights or the French Declaration of Man and Citizen. They emphasize the political and civil rights of the individual. Although interestingly enough, there is a stress on security rather than on happiness. Article 3 reads, "Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person." I mentioned this because the Articles 22 to 27 stress the right to socioeconomic security and social and cultural rights, rights that are proclaimed as indispensable to dignity. They go on to stress the right to work and protection from unemployment, the right to equal pay for equal work, remuneration, quote, "worthy of human dignity," end quote, the right to leisure and holidays, to an adequate standard of living, to food, to clothing, housing, and medical care, to a social net when misfortune or old age strike, a right to free basic education and affordable higher education, a right to enjoy the arts and participate in the cultural life of the community. So it's a really broad definition of human rights. These social, economic, and cultural rights go far beyond anything many countries, or the US Constitution for that matter, guarantees. When I introduce future lectures in this series, I'll explore briefly some of the reactions and controversies surrounding this declaration. But today, we want to use the lens of the social construct of gender to explore human rights in contemporary Africa, in particular in Zimbabwe and South Africa. Then in 2 weeks, we will be hearing about healthcare as a human right, and in October about indigenous rights in Latin America, all aspects of human rights that go beyond traditional civil rights. So without any further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Norma Krieger, an independent scholar and former consultant to the Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. Dr. Krieger received her PhD in political science from MIT and her BA in economics and mathematics from the University of Cape Town, South Africa. She has been a visiting professor at Saika and Kyoto universities, as well as the New School for Social Research. And she's taught for many years in the political science department at Johns Hopkins. She's been awarded numerous prestigious grants and fellowships from the MacArthur Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies. That's my page 5. And the Social Science Research Council, as well as Princeton Center of International Studies. She's also worked as a consultant in Zimbabwe and South Africa. She is the author of 2 books on Zimbabwe and many, many articles with topics varying from HIV, AIDS, and the human rights context in Zimbabwe, to transforming guerrillas into war veterans, that's of course GUER, land reform, transitional justice, and socioeconomic rights, as well as a recent consultancy report on courts and care services for rape victims in South Africa. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Krieger, who today will be speaking on gender and human rights in contemporary Africa.
Thanks very much. And thank you all for showing up. It's an amazing turnout. Now I have to get this PowerPoint working. I need help immediately. Okay, so I think, so that I don't constantly call for help, take a look at the map, and then I'm not going to refer back to it. I'm just going to move on. So, but I should say that the region that I know best is Southern Africa, and I'm going to focus on my work in Zimbabwe and South Africa. So these are the areas, the countries that I'll be referring to. Okay. Protecting the human rights of the most vulnerable people is correctly a matter of global urgency. On the African continent, hopes that the end of colonial rule would usher in a new era of respect for human rights were short-lived. Instead, wars and violence have taken a brutal toll on innocent civilians. Many African countries have constitutions that provide protections for civil and political rights, and even sometimes social, economic, and cultural rights. Most African states have also signed or ratified key international human rights laws. Moreover, many of you may be surprised to know that Africa has its own human rights instruments that are not much different from UN human rights laws. These formal legalisms have an important place in the struggle for the adherence to human rights. But it takes more than a legal document to make human rights a reality. Today I want to share with you some of the human rights issues that I have encountered in some 30 years of research and human rights advocacy in Southern Africa. My hope is to highlight some of the big challenges facing the people of Southern Africa and the world. The kinds of human rights violations that people struggle against and the obstacles to better enforcement of human rights are not specific to Southern Africa. They are widespread on the continent and beyond. Among the barriers to imposing human rights norms are cultures of patriarchy and violence, the quest for power, and international politics. I'd like to review 3 key historical and contemporary stories of human rights issues that are important to understanding the challenges of advancing human rights in Southern Africa and beyond. First, I'll discuss the historic struggle for liberation in Zimbabwe, raising issues about gender and sexual politics, as well as violence, that are part of this struggle and have continued in its aftermath. Second, I'll discuss the post-liberation government of Zimbabwe, focusing on the current government's campaign to crush its opposition and the human rights implications of the government's tactics. Third, I'll discuss human rights in a different post-liberation regime, that of South Africa. Efforts to address human rights, and particularly sexual exploitation of women, tell something of the hopes and difficulties of advancing human rights in this part of the world. Together, these three chapters in the history of Southern Africa help illustrate how the history of war and political conflict play out over time, both in violations of basic human rights and in efforts to rectify these violations. It's a complicated story encompassing how victims become perpetrators, how victims become liberators, who may in turn become perpetrators. These stories are sobering but not unique. After relating these stories, I will suggest some of the lessons they can teach us and some of the challenges that we face. First, Zimbabwe's Liberation War, which took place in the 1970s. ZANU, Robert Mugabe's liberation movement, claimed that it had popular legitimacy and was interested in promoting gender equality. The War of Liberation was fought against a white minority regime for an end to racial discrimination and for the rights to equality. So human rights were core to the struggle. In 1981, 1982, a while ago, I did dissertation research in the northeastern part of Zimbabwe on the relations between ZANU guerrillas and civilians. And here are some of the things I learned. Civilians reported the occurrence of widespread guerrilla violence and intimidation. Many civilians were killed or severely beaten by guerrillas, often at public meetings. The guerrillas used violence and intimidation for many different reasons: to assert power, to force parents to allow them to sleep with their daughters, to ensure villagers fed them meat, or to punish sellouts and instill fear among potential traitors. The guerrillas also got drawn into local political struggles of gender, generation, stratification, and lineage. A snapshot on gender politics and guerrilla violence, and also generational politics, is revealing. To win women's support, guerrillas got involved in trying to settle their grievances over wife-beating. Encouraged by the women, the guerrillas beat those men accused of beating their wives. But when men complained to the guerrillas that it was improper for them as youth to interfere in the marital disputes of their elders, the guerrillas withdrew their support from women, threatening to beat them if they ever again brought complaints about their husbands. Really, the guerrillas' primary interest was to win popular support and not to change gender relations. Is this PowerPoint working for you? Does it help at all? In the 1990s, I did research on the integration of guerrillas after the war. In the camps in exile, rape and sexual abuse by male guerrillas were evidently commonplace. Male guerrillas took advantage of the female guerrillas under their command and also acted like pimps when a big chef or important politician expressed a desire for a woman. Female commanders also helped to provide male commanders and high-ranking party officials with sex partners. A male commander told me that rape was indeed a problem. He could punish the offenders, but he asked rhetorically, should he stop the war to get them to stop raping women? Girls and women also consented to sex. A relationship with a senior commander brought them status, better food and living conditions, and the prospects of a good marriage. After the war, when women tried to expose their experiences in the camps, their complaints were dismissed by those with positions in government, including their own female wartime commanders. A brief rape scene in a film, Flame, which perhaps some of you have seen, about the war experiences of two female fighters and their personal struggle for freedom, so infuriated the War Veterans Association that it tried to ban the film, and that was in 1995, 15 years into independence. So those issues remain very much alive. The violations of human rights during the War of Independence were slow to surface. During the Cold War, human rights interests were never a priority of the superpowers. Human rights advocates and scholars often preferred to protect the liberation movement rather than its victims. The peace agreement ending the war granted a general amnesty to all who had committed human rights violations during the war, both on the guerrilla side and on the white minority government side. To this day, the liberation movements zealously guard the myth of their struggle. The liberation struggle remains an important symbolic resource that the ruling party invokes to justify all kinds of contemporary human rights abuses. So moving into the first decade of independence in Zimbabwe, you'll see some of the legacy of the liberation struggle. In these first years, Zimbabwe was governed under a state of emergency, but there are rights that cannot be derogated even in a state of emergency, including the right to life, the right to protection from inhuman treatment and torture, and so forth. The ruling party was faced with only a few hundred dissidents. Most had been guerrillas in the Liberation Army led by Joshua Nkomo, and belonged to an ethnic minority concentrated in the southwest. I don't have the map anymore. Marginalized in the new army by guerrillas belonging to Mugabe's party, which had its support base amongst the majority ethnic group, the Shona speakers, the dissidents resorted to guerrilla tactics. Mugabe's ruling party engaged in a two-pronged attack, one against the dissidents and the other against all Ndebele-speaking civilians in that southwestern part of the country. And one of the, it used its police force, the intelligence organization, the CIO, its army, and in addition, there was a special brigade that was trained by North Koreans as a result of links that the liberation movement had had with North Korea during its liberation struggle. And many of the most brutal atrocities have been attributed to this special brigade that was not actually part of the regular army. The government justified the use of force in terms of the need to protect state security against this small band of dissidents. But the government's response was disproportionate to any threat. The goal was really to decimate the opposition party and its ethnic support base. At least 6,000 people, and it's the lowest estimate I'm using, people frequently, I think, in feeling that somehow 6,000 people isn't enough lives, will use 20,000, 30,000, I've seen people use 50,000. 6,000 people, mainly innocent civilians, were killed and beaten, often in public, arbitrarily arrested and detained, abducted, disappeared, raped, and tortured. Homes were burned. People were buried alive, and their survivors had to dance and sing on their graves. Particularly before and after the 1985 elections, opposition members of parliament and candidates were targeted. having a high profile, a high position, was no protection. Victims were threatened if they sought medical help. In one area, a total food embargo was imposed for 3 months. Stores were closed, drought relief deliveries were stopped, houses were searched, and food found was destroyed. In 1987, the ruling party swallowed its smaller opponent in a unity accord. The violence ended. In 1988, right after party unity had been established, amnesties were extended to dissidents who laid down their arms and to all members of the security forces who had committed human rights violations. A culture of impunity was again reinforced. So right after the liberation struggle, a peace agreement with amnesties, after this counterinsurgency campaign in the southwest of the country, again, amnesties for the small group of dissidents and for the very large number of security forces who had been involved in human rights violations. Most people know very little about this conflict that occurred in a small part of the country during the 1980s. There were no UN Security Council resolutions denouncing the violations, no arms embargoes, no trade sanctions, no smart sanctions, and no effort to introduce such resolutions. Human rights issues in Zimbabwe at that time were not top priorities for the international community. If the litany of rights abuses that I've just been through seems relentless, it's worth bearing in mind that in the rest of the country, people were going about their day-to-day lives either oblivious of what was going on or, for their own reasons, if they did know, not willing to speak out publicly about it. International NGOs working in the zone of violence in 1983 have never released the reports they produced at that time. At least one major domestic NGO with quite powerful international links engaged during this time with the government to keep its programs going and to defend itself against accusations of supporting the so-called dissident party. In 1997, 2 local organizations courageously published the first major expose of state violence in the 1980s. One was a Catholic organization, and an attempt was made by the bishops who were in charge of that organization to actually suppress the publication. But the organization went ahead with another local non-governmental organization, put it online, and afterwards published the report. So even in 1997, tremendous fear and reluctance to publish accounts of what went on in the 1980s. So the next story about Zimbabwe brings us up to the present, and I hope you'll be able to see many connections between what happened in the liberation struggle, what happened in the 1980s, to this one small ethnic group in a tiny corner of the country, and what's going on in the country, the entire country today. Since 2000, the ruling party, if it's not obvious, has been the same since 1980. It's Mugabe's ruling party, ZANU-PF. It holds regular elections, and one can say, unlike many other African countries, that in that respect, it has been a democratic state. Since 2000, the ruling party has used similar tactics to destroy a new opposition and has been responsible for many of the same rights violations as in the 1980s. The main new rights violations were to the protection of property, and in particular to land owned by another minority, the whites. Whites continued to earn a disproportionate share of the land 2 decades into independence. As I said, Zimbabwe held regular competitive elections and continued to do so after 2000. In fact, there were elections in 2000, 2002, 2005, and two rounds of elections in 2008. Given that elections are opportunities for political violence, having so many elections has made it inevitably an incredibly grim period. The reason that elections are times of violence is that the Mugabe government treats elections as wars. And says as much, even when there is no threat of losing. But in 2000, there was a new opposition party, the Movement for Democratic Change. It's an inter-ethnic party, cuts across the minority ethnic groups, the one that was hammered in the southwest of the country, and the whites. Whites actually joined the party. And it's primarily an urban party. And in 2000, it emerged as a major threat to the ruling party. The response of Mugabe, senior politicians, local level politicians, it's the entire gamut, and the police and armed forces, was to declare during these elections that they would not allow the opposition to come to power. One might well ask, why bother to have an election? But holding elections are clearly terribly important as a demonstration of legitimacy and being a democratic country. The ruling party used its control of all radio and TV and the 2 major daily newspapers to portray the opposition party, civil society organizations, and the private media as Western-sponsored stooges and as seeking to overthrow the regime through violence. Western funds were poured into the opposition through democracy and human rights programs, and Western governments and the international financial institutions froze development assistance to the government. Obviously, a very infuriating international response. A government that's having problems contending against an opposition is denied funding, and funding goes from foreign countries and foreign organizations into the opposition. But the part of the propaganda story that's not correct is that the opposition was engaged in attempting to overthrow the government violently. The opposition has been engaged in trying to win elections in a peaceful manner. Staring at defeat in elections in 2000 and 2002, the ruling party used war veterans, the guerrillas who had fought in the Liberation War, and newly formed youth militia with army and police support to invade white-owned land, white-owned farms, large commercial farms, to illegally confiscate and redistribute the land to its supporters, and then retroactively legalize the land seizures and the redistribution or reallocation of the land. Thousands of farm workers were beaten or killed, had their homes and other possessions burned or seized, and lost their jobs. For white farmers, it was a very similar fate. Land redistribution did win the party's support at first, but the land seizures have also been the reason for millions today requiring food aid. Without your party card, without your ZANU-PF card, you really are an open target for all kinds of human rights violations. The government has used the need for food to its advantage. To get food aid from the party, you must be a party supporter. To get land, you must produce your ZANU-PF card. To get ARVs, antiretrovirals, HIV is a huge problem in Zimbabwe. It seems to help to be connected to the party. To get medical help, particularly if you've been a victim in political violence, you need your party card, or you cannot be an opposition member. To get a government job, same thing. Without a party card and known party loyalty, you can be beaten, arbitrarily arrested, raped, tortured, and even killed. In 2005, over 700,000 people, that's roughly 6% of the total population of the country, it has about 12, 13 million people, were left homeless and deprived of their livelihoods when the army and police smashed homes and businesses, or actually forced people to destroy their own homes or their own informal businesses. This military-style operation was conducted in large part to punish urban people because they had voted for the opposition party in an election a few months earlier. The ruling party expected to lose the urban vote again in the March 2008 election, but not the vote in its rural heartland. Because the guerrilla war was fought in the rural areas, that's remained the area where, for whatever reasons, fear, some connection to, positive connection to having been involved in the liberation war, that's the area, particularly in the majority ethnic groups area, where ZANU-PF has been able to count on getting votes. And when in the March 2008 elections, to their surprise, voters actually dared not to vote for the ruling party. The ruling party then went on a campaign of terror in its own rural heartland. So, whereas in the 1980s it was against a different ethnic group with allegiance to a different political party, in 2000 it was really against its own support base, its own primarily Shona support base. The perpetrators of violence have often been known to their victims by name. Human rights organizations actually produce incredibly detailed reports on what's been going on in Zimbabwe since 2000, and victims frequently know who it is who's been responsible for beating them or killing members of their family. Yet it is rare for perpetrators to be arrested, brought to court, and convicted. Victims reporting perpetrators to police, however, risk arrest. So there really is, the police and the army are totally behind the ruling party. New laws curtailed freedom of expression, assembly, and association. Most opposition newspapers were forced to close down, journalists were hounded, and most foreign reporters were denied entry. NGOs in the opposition party had great difficulty organizing and holding rallies. In June 2008, in the midst of a humanitarian crisis, the government prohibited NGOs from operating in the rural areas, the main reason being that it was engaged in this campaign of terror and it didn't want NGOs to actually witness what was going on. The ban has been partially lifted, but only partially lifted, and the humanitarian crisis in the country continues to deepen. So, what have international and regional organizations done in the midst of the post-2000 political and economic crisis? In contrast to the West's response to the human rights violations in the 1980s, the US and the EU tried, after the election in June 2008, to get the United Nations Security Council to pass a resolution imposing travel sanctions and asset freezes on key members of the ruling party, as they themselves had done, the US and the EU had done that in 2002. One can ask what effect that has, but nonetheless, there was that effort to do that. China, now involved heavily in the Zimbabwean economy and generally more and more involved in Africa, Russia and South Africa all opposed the resolution, and so it did not pass. African organizations have also failed to denounce the regime's human rights violations. After the re-election of Mugabe in June 2008, his contender, who had won the first round of the election, withdrew because of violence and torture against his supporters. So it was a totally sham election. But after the election, the African Union and the Southern African Development Community, which is the relevant regional organization in Southern Africa, called on the government of Zimbabwe to negotiate a government of national unity with the opposition. That was the response. It avoided saying that the president of Zimbabwe should form a government of national union, but the government should basically get involved in a power-sharing arrangement with the opposition. The negotiations are ongoing. The message that the regional organizations and the African Union have sent is really chilling. It's acceptable to win an election through terror and then engage with the opposition that's actually defeated you and from a position of power, form a government of national unity. Crucial and divisive issues in the ongoing negotiations are over who will control the executive. Will the new president be Mugabe or Tsvangirai, the leader of the opposition party who won, but not by enough votes to have an outright victory in the first round of the presidential election? Who will control the army and police? And will those who have committed human rights violations be prosecuted? These are very similar questions to those which arose in 1980 during the peace negotiations at the end of the liberation struggle. South Africa, the one country that could bring economic and diplomatic pressure on the region, supports ZANU-PF, if no longer President Mugabe. Ironically, mass migration, perhaps 1/3 of the 12 million people have left the country, has helped to strengthen the regime because remittances are sent back, and that's now a major source of foreign exchange. But it's also helped to weaken the opposition party because it's meant that the vast majority of the younger working age population, which is the core support base of the opposition party, is now outside Zimbabwe. Most of these migrants have gone to South Africa, where many have become victims of xenophobia and other rights abuses. Sorry, I'm getting a little behind here with the PowerPoint. Sexual violence in South Africa is another chapter that I want to speak about. Numerical data on sexual offenses is hopelessly inadequate, but experts observe that the evidence points to a conclusion, and I'm quoting here, that women's right to give or withhold consent to sexual intercourse is one of the most commonly violated of all human rights in South Africa. The South African Law Reform Commission study, published in 2000, found only 7% of reported rape cases resulted in convictions. Comparable rape convictions in the US are not terrific, but they are substantially higher at about 19%, 19. Child rape numbers are high. Some 40% of reported rape cases in 2005 and 2006 are of child rape. The gap between reported and actual rapes is believed to be huge. Poor prosecution and investigation are big factors behind South Africa's high rates of crime and low rates of conviction. In 1999, President Mbeki set up a special sexual offences and community affairs unit and appointed a woman as its head, locating it in the National Prosecuting Agency. The unit was responsible for coordinating the establishment of new sexual offences courts, specialised courts which would hear only sexual offences cases, and also for presiding over what are called Tutuzelu care centres. These are supposed to provide 24-hour service, medico-legal services, and counselling services to rape victims. And they must be located in a government health facility. So let me first talk very quickly about the sexual offences courts, and I'm going to call them SOCs, so just as shorthand. They were intended to enhance victims' access to justice and to reduce secondary trauma. The new courts were designed to have more specialized staff to improve prosecutions and investigations and ultimately thereby conviction rates. If SOCs were to meet the blueprint established by the SOCA unit, the new unit, there were inevitably going to be additional costs. It was going to be an expensive process to get more personnel in these courts, better trained, sensitized to the sexual offences cases that they were hearing. In 2007, the Minister of Justice, a woman, called for all sexual offences cases to be heard in ordinary courts, basically for a return to the status quo, and that this should happen over the next 3 years. The main reason for doing so was she felt that the new specialized courts were urban-based and created unequal access to justice, that people who were in urban areas had a chance of access to a better type of justice than people in the rest of the country. So the idea was to return all sexual offense cases to ordinary courts and to try to improve all the ordinary courts. The decision to embark on this major policy change was made without an independent audit of the cost and performance of these sexual offense courts compared with the performance of ordinary courts in sexual offense cases. Institutional turf wars between the SOCA unit and the Minister of Justice, who has the ultimate authority over whether to establish a new court, were clearly one of the main driving forces behind this very important policy change. There were no consultations with NGOs, even though they provide critical victim assistance services in both the specialized courts and the ordinary courts. And there was no independent assessment of what it would cost the Ministry of Justice to try to raise these ordinary courts to whatever standard of justice was being administered in the specialized courts. Human rights and special rights protections for children, which are guaranteed in the Constitution, appear to have taken backstage in institutional politics, and there are also signs that the government wanted to sideline or marginalize the independent role of NGOs as service providers, even though they are terribly important as service providers and do a lot of voluntary service provision. But there is a sense, the desire to have control over the NGOs and for the government to actually be providing the services. The story with the Tutuzela care clinics, is quite different. It's exactly the opposite. The policy decision was taken to rapidly expand the number of these care centers. And donors like UNICEF and USAID are key funders. Our spontaneous visits to 2 of these centers were discouraging and really essentially confirmed what we had found written in 2 audits of these TCCs, one of which had been commissioned by the National Prosecuting Agency, but then had been suppressed because the information was, the review was not favorable. We too found that doctors on casualty duty in hospitals do not want to examine rape victims. As a result, victims may have to wait unacceptably long hours, adding to secondary trauma. At one TCC, the hospital director had reportedly instructed doctors not to give medical treatment to rape victims because she didn't want the TCC to be in the hospital. Doctors did not want to be taken away from casualty work. They didn't want to deal with rape victims, was the bottom line. At this TC, most hospital staff could not direct us to the rape clinic in the hospital, and when we found it, there were no staff on duty. The TCCs are supposed to be 24-hour one-stop, to offer 24-hour one-stop services to rape victims. The image of the SOCA unit, the body presiding over these care units, we got was of total disregard for the functioning of these clinics. There's clearly an urgent need for an independent audit of TCC's performance before donors invest in expanding their number. Our impromptu visits to TCCs made clear that they are not, as donors and the government claim, best practice models, even though they are already being exported to other countries. It's very much a high-profile advertising campaign that both the government and the donors appear to be involved in. I don't know if any of you read about Jacob Zuma's rape trial in 2006 in South Africa, but I thought I'd just very quickly talk about it because it does give you a sense of another layer of obstacles to human rights, gender rights, sexual rights in South Africa. Jacob Zuma could well be the next president in South Africa. He was the deputy president from 1999 to 2005, and he's a polygamist. He was very active in the ANC during the liberation struggle, and he was charged with raping the daughter of a friend of his, deceased, and the woman he knew was HIV positive. The trial brings into public a clash between a culture of patriarchy and a Zulu traditional culture against what seems to be a very small group of urban-based human rights organizations who believe in universalistic human rights. Throughout the trial in 2006, Zuma had strong support from within the ANC. It was not unanimous support, but very strong sector of support from the ANC, the Communist Party, the ANC Youth League, and also the trade unions. All these organizations are part of the ANC governing coalition in South Africa. Traditional Zulu leaders also supported Zuma. Zuma is Zulu, Zulu being an ethnic group. Zuma supporters wore T-shirts saying 100% Zulu boy, and outside the courthouse engaged in allegedly intimidating anti-rape activists who had launched a campaign called 1 in 9 to make the case that, using figures that are hard to verify, but nonetheless, that only 1 out of 9 rapes actually gets reported. Outside the court, Zuma supporters also burned photos and effigies of the rape accuser and chanted, "Burn the bitch." Together with Zuma, they sang the Liberation War song, "Bring Me My Machine Gun." So it's a very macho culture. Traditional Zulu leaders outside the court used medicines to ensure Zuma's acquittal. Inside the court, chiefs dressed in traditional skins sat in the front row. In court, Zuma tried to present himself as a traditional Zulu man. For example, he said his accuser had dressed provocatively by wearing a traditional African cloth. It's called a kanga, and it's actually considered to be really modest dress. And that he was, in Zulu culture, obliged to accept her obvious invitation to have sex. The white judge was persuaded, and Zuma was acquitted. Zuma went on to ask President Mbeki in the ANC leadership contest. Whoever becomes president of the ANC is, so far it's been the pattern, becomes the next president. I have 2 cartoons. Let me see if I can. There's one. Actually, a cartoon about Zuma in the press in South Africa has just recently got the cartoonist into really deep trouble. Here, it's fairly obvious what's going on. Zuma is the one with a big bulge. That's Zuma, that's his defense counsel, the judge sitting over there, and the rape accuser in the stand. And the next one, did any of you read about the Zuma trial? I don't know how, yeah. So here, AIDS activists were furious because Zuma had been the chairman of a national AIDS campaign, and one of the central messages was, abstain, be faithful, and use condoms. So, but what he said in court was he knew the woman was HIV positive, but he was going to. He didn't think that the risk of sex was very high, of getting HIV/AIDS through sex was very high, and that he would still further lower the risk by having a shower afterwards. So here he is with a shower. So, I focused on Zimbabwe and South Africa to try to build some context and provide some history. But there are other stories of violence and abuses playing out in Africa. Perhaps best known in this country is the counterinsurgency in Darfur, but even more deadly is the violent conflict that's going on in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. For now, I'd like to wrap up by asking what we can learn from this difficult history that can help us think constructively about the prospects for advancing human rights in the future. I'd like to suggest that we consider 4 moral dilemmas, or dilemmas nonetheless, that arise in the accounts that I offered. But they're also, I think, general dilemmas arising from human rights violations. Whoops. First, what should foreign sponsors of democracy programs do when regimes respond by crushing the recipients of donor funds? It's obviously been a big part of the story in Zimbabwe. It's true in many other countries. Western donors want to support opposition groups, and for fragile governments, there's a threat, and inevitably there is backlash. So what really is the responsibility of the donors when funding opposition parties, and what should the donors do when the opposition parties get hammered? Second, political compromise to move out of political stalemates is often necessary, but where does one draw the line? Do you negotiate even with rulers who have been responsible for organizing gross human rights violations? Do you provide amnesties for the perpetrators of rights violations as a trade-off for a negotiated settlement and the hope of some stability, if not democracy? Do you permit perpetrators to hold posts in governments of national unity? Third, is out-migration a solution when internal political change is stymied by state violence? What obligations do regional countries have to integrate migrants? The Zimbabwe situation has generated a huge outflow of people, especially to South Africa. I recently investigated the conditions facing Zimbabweans in South Africa. There obviously isn't time, but if it's of any interest, I'd be very happy to talk about it. Finally, what do governments do about illegally seized land that has been retroactively legalized? Do they accept the status quo for the sake of stability, let people who've seized land keep it? Because obviously if you take it away, you might be inviting a response you don't want. Do they redistribute the land to new beneficiaries in a transparent way? Do they return land to the people from whom it's being confiscated? Or do they pay huge compensation costs to people who've had their land illegally confiscated? The history of violence and human rights abuses presents a daunting challenge to Africa and the world. Both preventing and remedying human rights abuses seems to become enmeshed in trade-offs with stability, costs, and other economic and political interests. These other powerful concerns and interests make it difficult to deal with human rights issues in isolation and to make them the priority that we would all like them to be. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions.